This is Justice Worriers, a podcast where we think about things that are right and wrong in our world and how Christian ideas can help us respond to them. We prefer hard questions over easy answers, and we'd love you to join us in our ramblings. Listen in and contact us using the links in the show notes. Hello and welcome to Justice Warriors episode 48. My name's Andy and as usual I'm joined by Leah. Say hi Leah.
Hi there.
And Jörg. Say hi Jörg.
Hello.
And we are very lucky to be also joined by Anna. Say hi Anna.
Hello.
And Anna, we have got you on because we got chatting to you and it sounded like there was a lot of interesting stuff in your life, and we're really interested to hear basically your story and especially how that relates to your faith and how your faith knits into that. Mm-hmm. You're a member of St John's, and where do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I was thinking when you said tell your story, what on earth do I start? Yeah. So I guess maybe I'll start more recently and then go backwards. So I came to St John's about a year ago, having not long before moved to the area and looking for a new church and a new community. And it was interesting you mentioned prayers earlier, Andy, because did you do prayers at Remembrance service last year?
Yeah, probably.
That was my first service at St John's. I remember thinking, wow, those prayers were amazing. I've just been really welcomed and got stuck in. So I recently moved to the area. I'd actually been living in Rwanda for the few years prior to coming to St John's. I lived in Kigali. I worked for Tear Fund, which is a Christian relief and development organisation. I went out in 2020 as business development manager. I moved in January 2020, which is not a good time to move country. And at the time, there was like talk of COVID, but no one really knew anything about it. And I remember in about February having brunch with some friends and then being like, have you heard about this virus? Yeah, we're getting married in April. Like, hopefully it'll be fine. And then, 3 weeks later, there's global lockdowns and we were all in lockdown. And
what was it like in Rwanda?
Yeah, it was... They got a handle on it really well, really quickly. So we locked down a little bit earlier than the UK. Right. I'd say our lockdowns were shorter but stricter than here. So everyone talked about, I can only go for my one walk a day. And I was like, we can't even go for that. So I was very jealous. But at the same time, in a country where you haven't got NHS and you haven't got all the resources that you've got here, they had to be really strict on it. And I remember a friend said to me quite early on, Rwanda managed to keep Ebola out. I trust Rwanda. Right. And that really kind of struck me of like, yeah, these guys know what they're doing. Right. And very quickly, hand washing stations popped up everywhere. And the rules were super clear. And yeah, no comment on other places. And it was really, really tough. I mean, my boss said to me, do you want to go back to the UK? And I was like, well, no, I've moved here. I live here. I've come to serve. I've come to work in humanitarian work. This is a humanitarian crisis. And it was a really interesting day where some friends and I, we sort of knew that this lockdown was coming. So we'd gone out of the city for the day, just spent some time together, just kind of chatting and hanging out. And then that night we got the notice that we were going to lockdown. So we absolutely pounded it back to the city so that we weren't trapped in the middle of nowhere. Wow. And, my boss sort of phoned me and said, okay, you all right? You staying? And I said, yeah, I'm staying. And a few days later, in that time, a lot of our friends did leave. Like some organisations pulled people out. Some people chose to leave. And they closed the airspace in Rwanda. Right. So I remember watching the last plane leave and being like, well, okay, I live here now. And that was the right decision. And I had these 3 amazing housemates and we got each other through it. We became a little family, really. But I think the hardest thing was then not knowing if something happened, like if one of my family members got COVID or if things never did. But, what if things kind of got violent in Rwanda or whatever? what would I do? And so I was sort of planning, could I drive to Tanzania? Could I get a flight out there? But thankfully, I never had to worry about those things. I was able to be on the front line of the response. So I worked with some of our local partners and church partners in Rwanda to do like a food distribution. We, the government, were very good at kind of identifying people who were going to be more vulnerable, people living sort of hand to mouth, or market vendors who then weren't able to work at the market, or farmers. So we were doing food distributions with our local leaders and connecting with them. And being able to raise some funding as well. And then my role as kind of business development was supposed to be writing a funding strategy and kind of big thinking, and suddenly it just became to like fighting fire basically, and how do we get money now? But of course as well, Rwanda is a fairly development context, so I was doing a bit of humanitarian work. We'd had a bit of flooding and some peace building stuff, but it was mainly kind of longer term livelihoods projects. So that's a lot of like training, going to the field, working alongside people. So suddenly when you're in lockdown, you can't do any of these things. So we all had to kind of pivot really quickly of like, how do we do our normal programs?
Right.
And I do remember a few weeks prior to the UK lockdown, when we had to stop one of our programs, and somebody in the UK said to me, well, who gave you permission to stop programming? And I went, the Rwandan government. There's a pandemic. And that kind of showed the like difference of like Rwanda were like very like on it earlier, I would say. But yeah, it was amazing. It sparked my interest in innovation, which is what I do now. I work in the innovation team at another charity. And I think, realising like you can move quickly, you can change things. There is space to do things better when things can't be done in the normal way. There's actually some really beneficial things there. Some of our programming changed. We weren't able to get to the field, for example. So I was sort of saying, well, we've got these groups of women who meet in savings groups. They're already there. They're in their community. Why don't we just equip them to be the humanitarian actors, to do the cash transfers, to do the food handouts? Like, we can't get there, but they're there. And so actually that was an amazing project that we saw generate great results and work with other NGOs on, and we were really thankful kind of for the support on that one. So it was a huge amount of learning. I think one of the hardest things was when the airspace then opened again, a few people were like, I need to go, had kind of come to the end of their time in country, or had decided they wanted to move back to their home country. So I was there for 2.5 years altogether, and about at least 3 times, I'd say 80% of my friendship group had just gone in one go. And when you're a single person and your friends are your family, that was really tough, because you sort of feel like a bomb's gone off, and then you sort of crawling out like who survived this one, who's still there. And a friend said to me, Anna, it can be good again. And I remember sort of meeting new friends and connecting and forming a new little group. And then for those sort of 7-8 months, that was probably the best time. Some of my best friends I'm still really close with, but then again, it all happened again, and the summer rolled around and people's lives changed, and people got new jobs or new opportunities, or, aging parents, whatever it is that pulls them out of country. So then you're kind of here again and having to rebuild that again. So that was tough. But I was incredibly thankful, and I think in some ways I probably had a better experience. I know that Christmas 2020, when it was sort of cancelled here, I went to Mombasa. I had a great time. Spent Christmas on the beach. Couldn't put too much on social media because I thought everyone's going to hate me. I'm just sunbathing with a cocktail. But that was obviously tough, just not being able to be with family. And I think the big thing was not knowing when I could get back. And then Rwanda went onto the red list. So as we affectionately called it, hotel prison. So anyone coming from a red list country into the UK had to quarantine in a hotel for 2 weeks. At a cost of, I think, £2,000. And I was like, I'm not doing that.
It's not fair.
But I also really, at that time, it was summer 2021, so the Delta variant was getting quite bad across a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, and Rwanda was going to another lockdown, and I was like, by that point I was living on my own, and I thought, I don't want to lock down on my own in a flat. Maybe this is a good time to go back to the UK for a month or so, work remotely from there, enjoy seeing friends, and then hopefully things might calm down a little bit. I still had planned to go back to Rwanda, and I did go back. So I was in the UK for about a month then, but I had to spend 10 days in Amsterdam because ridiculously I could get from Amsterdam to the UK without having to do any quarantine or tests, but I couldn't go from Rwanda.
Yeah.
But once I got to Amsterdam, they didn't care. They were like, why are you wearing a mask? Like, everyone was just out and about. And so it was very jarring, I think, being in a country that was taking it so seriously. We have masks everywhere. Everywhere you went. As soon as you left the house, you had to wear a mask. Hand washing stations everywhere, as I say, tests everywhere, to somewhere that was like, just we don't care, whatever. And then that was allowed to be in the UK. So it brought up a lot for me about, how do we perceive African countries and Africa and all of these kinds of things.
That idea of chaos and disorganisation that just wasn't there at all.
Right,
it was
totally.
Just, not a thing.
Absolutely. It was mega organised, and I think, they'd had the lessons from Ebola and how to manage that. But it was a very interesting time, I would say. But I do remember there were some moments, I remember, because they would release every day, they'd say, this many new cases, probably similar to the UK, like this many new cases, this many recoveries, whatever. And there was one day there was no new cases, and we've got this video from my housemates and I think we were like deep lockdown, like just dancing around the house, like it's going to end. And then there was another, months of it. But but it was also kind of unifying, I guess, because although I was living, 7,000 miles away from my friends and family here, there was this unifying thing that we were all going through. So like, I spoke to my family every week on a Zoom quiz that I hadn't planned to do that when I moved. And, we were able to sort of share those experiences, even though it looked different. But what's interesting now is people will talk about COVID and I'm like, oh, did that happen? Or like, oh, what's that like? And they're like, yeah, don't you remember? And I'm like, well, I wasn't here. Like, it's such a weird time. But and then before that, I was in London for a few years, but very much between East Africa and the UK. So then going back a fair few years, I went to Royal Holloway and graduated in 2013 and moved to Uganda pretty much straight after graduating. I'd been there for a month during my university years, like in one of my summers. And I'd had family links there. I've got an auntie who's Ugandan. My mum was born in Uganda. My grandparents had been missionaries there. So it'd always been a place that was really on my heart. And I went for this month. My poor mum was kind of like, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. You can go for a month and, get out of your system. And then 10 years later, she's like, I'm not going to Heathrow anymore. But so I went back to Kampala. I went to Kampala. I just felt like there was more I needed to do. And classic, I was supposed to go for 6 months and then I ended up extending and staying for basically a year. And I worked for a local charity called Smile Charity Uganda, who are still working and they do amazing stuff, working with children in slum communities in Okolabie and in some of the schools. And we were doing we had like a group of Ugandan volunteers who were just amazing and they were kind of running the programme. So we were working alongside them really and doing kids clubs and education classes and some of the outreach in the community and just the I think for us really it was I don't know how much of a difference I made, but it was a huge opportunity for me to learn. And I was part of an amazing church, Kampala Baptist, that still, I sort of see that as my other home church. And I joined the dance group there, which was hilarious because I thought I was really good. And then I watched videos and was like, oh yeah, no. They can actually dance. Like all my Ugandan friends, there's beautiful like African dancing and then there's me like thinking I look really cool, but I definitely don't. But that was a lot of fun. And I was a very creative person, being able to just be somewhere where music and dance and drama were just like part of the lifeblood of it. It's great. So came back when did I come back? August. And was pretty miserable. Didn't want to be in the UK. I was very grumpy. And so I said to my mum, I'm going to go back to Uganda. There's more for me there. God's got more for me there. But I want to see some other places as well. So I'm going to do this road trip and I'm going to go to Kenya and Burundi and Tanzania and Rwanda as well. And she just looked at me and she was like, you're mad. But she sort of said, well, if you can fund it, you can do it. Thinking, she's never going to fund this. There's no chance. So I got a job just working in like a local hotel and I did a lot of fundraising and to my mother's horror, I raised the funds. There were times when it was a little hairy when I was sort of praying, God, give me the money to buy this bus ticket or whatever. But I couldn't in the end go to Kenya and Burundi because of different political tensions at the time. But so I went to Uganda. So I went back to work for Smile for a couple of weeks. And then I found another organisation called Rahab. and they work with women in sort of forced sex work and transactional sex work. And I was able to do some Bible studies with them. And again, it was really about me learning. And I connected with a lot of these local organisations and said, I just want to learn from you. Like, I'm young, I'm white and British. Do I have anything to add? Do I have anything to offer you? Can I just come and see what you do? So I did some work with Rahab, which I loved. It was really challenging. Just the nature of the work and how young the women were. I mean, I say women, they were girls, 14, 15. But we also became really good friends, and that was really special. And I met some really lovely other expats as well, which was nice. And then I flew to Tanzania, having never been to Tanzania, didn't know anybody. I just kind of like connected with this charity and was like, can I come and work for you for a month? And they were like, yeah. So like stayed with this Tanzanian family for a month. And that was, again, that was amazing. So that was called New Hope for Girls Tanzania. That's based in Dar es Salaam. And they is a home for about 30 to 40 girls at any one time. And the girls often from quite, difficult backgrounds and unsafe backgrounds. So they stay with the family. They're called Consola and Leah, and they're still very good friends of mine. And then there's another kind of maybe 100 girls in the community who come in, but it's all really self-sustained. They sort of train the parents and the caregivers in financial savings. They help with school fees for the girls. They help with vocational skills. They've got like rabbits, and they do cookery classes, all these kinds of things, just to really give back to the community. And Consola's story is just, talk about forgiveness. Like I'm sure she won't mind me sharing, she says it very openly. She was left to live with an aunt, I think, when she was about 9, and horrifically abused. Like, you couldn't even imagine. Like, walked on in high heels, walked on her back in high heels. She's still got broken back. Fed rotting food, just really horrific. And she told me the story. She was at a bus stop, she's trying to run away, and this man tried to rape her, and she said, God, if you save me now, just help me, I will give my life to serving your children. And she is the most beautiful, like, glowing person, full of God's love. And I said to her so many times, like, how do you forgive? And I've also had very interesting conversations with her husband, Leah, and he said, it's harder for me to forgive knowing what they did to my wife. And that's been super interesting. But they're like my Tanzanian parents, so I've been back to see them a few times, and that's really special. And then I flew to Rwanda, that's right, and spent a few weeks with another local organisation in Rwanda, just visiting savings groups, and again, just like learning about the history and sort of learning what is there a role for me in this kind of work in this world. It's something I really care about, but I don't really know. So I did that, and then I got a bus on my own, which probably wasn't the best idea, but it's what you do when you're 23, from Kigali in Rwanda up to Kampala. And then just spent a few more weeks with mates hanging out in Kampala and just having a great time. And then I came back to the UK and again was pretty miserable and pretty depressed. And I looked for some jobs, and I can't even remember what I did. I think I worked for Tear Fund for a little bit, like in the engagement centre kind of customer supporter care team. Saved up a bit more money, and then went back to Uganda. Went back to work for Rahab for another 4 or 5 months. And they actually offered me to stay longer term. And at the time I was doing quite a lot of creative programmes with the girls. So again, they've got like a year-long programme, so it was quite a new cohort of women, but stuff with them about how to use drama and music and dance to tell their stories and advocate for change for girls and women. And I really prayed about whether to stay, and I really wanted to stay, but at that time I was like, I need to settle, I need to have something of value to give. And I felt like, I've got all this experience, but I don't know what I can offer. And I looked into going abroad with CMS, and I prayed into that, and a friend said to me, I think you just need to like figure out what your vision is. And I think he was really right. And I was very angry because I was like, no, I know I want to be in Africa, but it's like, but what are you going to do? And so I think by that point I was like, okay, yeah, I need to make a bit of a plan here. So moved back to the UK, moved to London, worked for Tear Fund, and sort of started off again in the kind of fundraising supported teams, but moved into the international team, worked on West Africa for a bit, which was really interesting, on humanitarian stuff, and moved into kind of work in Central African Republic and Congo and the Sahel, which was great. But always had those links and those ties with Uganda, and any opportunity to go back, Christmas, Easter, any chance. I was on a plane. I was off. And was applying for jobs and was like, I want to be there. So then I got this job in Rwanda, and spent 2.5 years there, and then very sadly I got sick, which is actually why I left Rwanda. So this was 2022. I'd just come back from my 3rd year. I just started a new job actually at a different organisation, and was really excited. But like my first day, I remember feeling very overwhelmed and very stressed. And I phoned a friend and I was like, Marnie, I just don't know what to do. I'm feeling really overwhelmed. And she took me out for lunch and she was like, Anna, you are burnt out. And I was like, I'm not burnt out. I'm fine. What do you mean working through a pandemic is going to burn me out? I don't know what you're talking about. So, she really challenged me, and I was like, and I sort of thought, okay, maybe in the summer, maybe at the end of this year, I'll think about kind of moving back. And, I was missing, by that point I had 2 nieces, and I was missing being part of their lives, and parents, and, grandparents getting older. And so there was that kind of, that pull to go back was starting to emerge, but I very much ignored it. And I think partly because I felt like this is my calling. This is who I am. This is who I've always been, is Anna who lives in Africa. And when I'm not there, I'm planning how to be there. So how can I fail? How can I burn out by doing something I love? And 2 years didn't feel that significant. I had friends who'd been there for 5 years, 10 years. And that's what I thought I'd be. Anyway, series of various ill health, in and out of visiting various doctors, in and out of hospitals. Ended up having a CT scan because I thought I had appendicitis, and actually had an ovarian cyst that then ruptured. So I was admitted into hospital. I was diagnosed with endometriosis at the time. So it was an endometrial cyst, which means it had blood, which means I had internal bleeding. So that was not a lot of fun. So then I was rushed into surgery in Rwanda. There was a lot of talk of like, should I go to Kenya for the surgery? And it was a very interesting time for me because partly they were trying to make me these big decisions, and I was like on morphine. So I was like, I don't know what my name is, like, let alone if I want to go to Kenya for this operation. But also a lot of things about, being a woman and making choices over my body, which stuff I'd never really experienced in that way before. But I decided to have surgery in Rwanda. I had friends there who'd visit me every day, and I knew the doctor, and they did a good job. And even after that, I was like, I think I can stay. And all my friends were like, Anna, you need to go. And so I really wrestled with it, and I prayed about it. I thought, well, I could go, and then I could come back and finish my contract, because my contract was due to end in a couple of months afterwards anyway. So I thought I could go and come back, or I could work remotely and then visit. And then it was kind of through exhausting all the other options that I was like, I have to go. Like, I can't, there's no way I can stay anymore. And the thought of going and then coming back to just leave again, I thought that's just going to be too hard. And it was the right thing. So my mum, by that point, she was able to come out to Rwanda. Not in the circumstances either of us had hoped for, but it was really special for me, even though I was very poorly, for her just to see my home and to meet some of my friends, people I talked about a lot. And she helped me pack up my life. And, I just sort of sat on the sofa while she was, do you want to keep this? Do you want to throw this away? Sell this? And so it was really, really hard. I didn't really get any chance to say goodbye. And then came back and spent a few months really with my parents, just recovering physically and mentally. And still kind of having to go in the hospital and have different checks and things. I'm doing much better now, but it was a huge, and I suppose the last couple of years really have been dealing with all of that, of like I say, I thought this was who I was, and in all that time I turned 30, and suddenly I was like, oh, proper adult now. And in all that time my friends were getting married and having kids, and I was like, my life was always going to be this aid worker in Africa, this humanitarian in Uganda or Rwanda or somewhere in East Africa. And suddenly I felt like my body had failed me. I felt like I'd failed. And now I'm in a really weird place where I'm like, I get to go back for work and I'm going back, but I'm not like, when am I next going? When am I next going on the plane? I'm like, even my next work trip, I'm like, it'll be good, but I don't need to go for like, they wanted me to go for like a month, and I was like, can I just do for like 2 weeks? And I was like, who am I?
Wearing the badge, they're the chosen whites. Those who died are justified for wearing the badge, they're the chosen whites. They're justified. Those that died, they're the chosen whites.
This is the question that's coming up for me. So there's an obvious. You've talked about an enormous amount of activity.
Yeah.
You've also talked about you said this is who I am a few times.
Yeah.
So I want to get at what is the drive, and where is the drive? I mean, I was going to say, is it God? But it's lots of people have met God and have not done this, so you need more explanation. So, what's the drive? What's going on?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and I always would say it was God. And I used to get very annoyed with my friends who didn't have that same heart for justice, because I was like, what do you mean you don't care that there's a war in like this really niche town in Togo? Like, they were like, well, we're students, like, just got to get my essay written or whatever. So I used to get very frustrated. Right. I think there's a lot of things. I think growing up in a home where lots of African influences, as I say, like my grandparents, my dad was a missionary in Nigeria, having a Ugandan auntie. And my parents always really practiced hospitality. So we always had different people from around the world at the kitchen table. Dad had friend, I don't even know how he met him, but some friend from Zimbabwe. He used to come and stay with us every summer, and so I'd always ask him questions about it. So I think there was something in me that God had put this heart for the nations, and the exposure that I'd had as a young person and growing up, and sort of our church, had people that we sent as missionaries, all that kind of stuff. I think seeing all of that definitely was a drive. I think also being someone who's very justice minded, and in my head, I think at the time it was like, well, that's where the need is and that's where poverty is. And so those two kind of work in tandem. And I think now with the way the aid sector's going and learning of, how do we do justice here and how do we do that? I think as well, probably a little bit of just who I am as a person. Like, I'm very community minded. And like I was saying, like, I love music and creativity. So there was this draw of being in a space where I just felt like I could be really true to who I was. I think I could take up space. I think, express myself, be musical, be creative, but be real with people as well, have really deep friendships. Some of my Ugandan friends are like my closest friends. And I think just having that permission and that way of community, after church, oh my goodness, church service would start at 11 and by about 4 o'clock you'd be like, I just need to go home. And it wasn't like the service had finished, but we just hang out, and like someone would bring food and then we'd hang out eating, and then someone else would be like, let's go for ice cream, and then you do that and then you're like, I've got work tomorrow, like I need to go home. But I think as an extrovert, as somebody who loves community and is very family minded, I think for me that I just felt like I was home, I guess. So I think a lot of different things. I think, to be honest as well, like, candidly speaking, I felt like I probably had something to prove a little bit. I went back to Rwanda last summer just for a work trip for a couple of weeks, and it was very interesting because first week I was loving it, and I was like, this is great. It's the goodbye I never had. I get to say goodbye to my friends. I did a safari. I was like, this is what I needed to say goodbye. I also did some work as well on a work trip. But I also felt like at that time I was like, yeah, I think I'm done. Right. Like, I felt like I'd had that closure that I just don't think I'd ever really had. And I remember saying to one of my really close friends out there, who's Burundian, he lives in Rwanda, I don't think I've got anything to prove anymore. Right. I think for a long time it was, if I'm this person who feels called to East Africa, who feels called to mission, who feels called to this kind of work, I've got to be the best at it. I've got to be like, absolutely smash it out of the park. And the expat world is quite weird in that people can be quite, comparison's very big in the expat world. People like to kind of outdo each other a little bit of like, well, how long have you been here? And how many places have you lived? And slightly out trauma each other as well. Like, well, I was abducted by the Taliban, and it kind of gets a bit ridiculous, but there is that element of like one-upmanship. And I think because you meet a lot of people who haven't had a conformist life, they haven't had the nice house or the family or whatever, they want to achieve in different ways. Right. So they want to prove that they've done good things in other ways. So I think I probably got sucked into that quite a lot as well, of I want to say I've been here for this long, and then my love for it is valid, and then I'm not just another white person who's gone and done some work in Africa. I think there was a desire to shake off that label, I suppose, a bit as well.
Talk to us a little bit more about justice, because I mean, the development space is not necessarily full of justice.
Not.
Not that it doesn't try, but I often see it, you're trying to connect global affluence with global poverty, and what you get is a lens into global injustice, even though you're trying to fix things locally and make things just. But as a go-between, the contrast you experience, you've already mentioned, how can people not care when you come home? So what is it you found out about justice? Did you learn something about justice? Or did you just learn something about injustice through these trips? So, can you unpack that a bit more?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think what comes to mind immediately is justice isn't what you think it looks like. So I think, when I was sort of perhaps younger and started out doing this work, I think I thought, about people living in poverty, in slums or in difficult situations. And then you think about people here, and most people have got cars and, houses and whatever. And yet there's a massive deprivation here in the mental health space. And there's a massive loneliness here, which is something I didn't really feel when I was in Uganda particularly. And so I think the nuance of it, of like, it's not about you've got to have what we've got and then it's about that kind of joint learning and that appreciation of good things. But I think also knowing that, as Jesus says, like, the poor will always be with you. And I used to hate that because I was like, but like, why? Like, that's not a thing. But I think just that realization of like, the need is massive and a lot of it is structural inequality. And yes, it's important to challenge these things and change these things. But also, we're never going to see that in our lifetime because it's just not possible. But just because that's true doesn't mean we don't do it for the one and for the individual. But I think as well, I've had to learn in my own life, and then I think applying this to this phrase of justice about mercy and kind of, also getting what you don't deserve. And I think, justice isn't just about people who are living in difficult situations, whether that's here or in a different country, getting what we've got or getting what we think they should have. It's also about true justice is us really being brought down and being like, we've been so over-consumeristic and we've consumed so much more than we need. And actually, true justice would be us massively just kind of being punished for that. And so kind of learning about mercy in that space as well of what does it look like to seek that. And I think also comes down to relationships. And I think I saw it very much as like you kind of explained, like almost a power thing and a power dynamic of the kind of affluent to the less so. And I think now I see it more as a relationship between people that I've had the privilege of working alongside and learning from, and people like Consola, who I mentioned. And for her, justice would look like those perpetrators going to prison. And for her, they haven't, and she's forgiven. But what she's done is extend that, what she should have received, to others. And perhaps that's what we can think about doing, is what we receive and what we should receive in place of our own misdemeanors should go as a mercy to others. But you also touch on a bigger point of my frustrations with the aid sector and my usually daily gripes of
that leads that's exactly the follow-up question that's rattling in my head. Like, is the global charity sector set up to do this? I mean, I know even with the mission partnership team in St. John's, it's a push to say we have something to learn here, and not just to give. We have something to heal here, our own callousness and lack of care beginning. But also, like you're saying, there's so many amazing examples of people giving out of nothing, giving out of need, which we just don't even think about talking. Like there's so much. If I've been hurt, I deserve to lash out. I deserve to be heard, and that has its points. But like you, I've often seen people who, for various circumstances, have just to overcome tremendous hardship, and they get up the next day and they cook food and they invite people around, And that resilience, that honesty about our limits, you know, so there's so much that we could learn about, and we just don't. We're not set up to do that.
Yeah. I completely agree. And it's been something that I've struggled with for a long time. I think when I was younger, I was like, I'm going to change the world. And then especially since coming back from Rwanda, and obviously coming back so unexpectedly and working in different charities, and being like, this is so colonial. This is so like, we're getting money and we're telling you what to do and we're putting all these like limitations on you. And I think for me, that's where it all really boils down to that thing of relationships. And I just thank God that he put on my heart, or you know, these years ago, go out and learn from people on the ground who are doing it, who are from those countries. So Anne, who runs Rehab, is Ugandan, Consolo and Leah, Tanzanian. You know, actually people who get it much more than I ever would. And I think because I've just been able to build those relationships with people, but also the people who are experiencing it, like I was talking about the women in the Rehab project. You know, I still remember them and like some of the like jokes we had together. One of them was from a place called Katwe. It was the time when the film The Queen of Katwe came out. So I used to call her the Queen of Katwe, and she used to say, Auntie Anna, Her Majesty is here. And so, you know, being able to just build up those friendships and being like, we've got something to share. It's not, I've got this to give to you.
Right.
And I remember when I was in Rwanda and having a colleague in the UK, and he said to me, you know, we exist as our team, they were a sort of technical team, and he was like, we exist as a service to you guys. What do you need from us? And I think that was such a good posture. And it's one that I've really tried to take into my work now of how do I serve our colleagues who are doing this work, who know the need, and how do I be in a space where I'm really collaborative. And also, I kind of touched on this, like everyone suddenly having to become innovators, and innovation being a massive buzzword of the sector at the moment. But I work in the innovation lab, and I think it's probably saved my faith, but also my belief in the sector, because I think actually being like, we are seeing that there are faults, and therefore we're doing things differently, and there's an investment in that. I think for a long time, people kind of knew there were faults, knew the system was broken, but it was a bit like, oh, we don't want to talk about that, we'll brush that under the carpet. Whereas I think in the space of innovation and localisation, I think go really hand in hand, because that's where you can really, that's where new ideas can generate. And it's like, well, where are you getting these new ideas from, actually? So I think it's about having that posture of learning, as you say, and of reciprocal kind of, we've all got something to give here, and just we're all parts of the body, and what's my role in this? And I remember I was at a conference, and there was a girl from a youth-led organisation speaking, and she just said, you know, money that you give to us as kind of grants with loads of requirements, it's not real money. And that really kind of stuck with me as well, of like, how do we, as much as possible, just get out of the way, but also create things that are self-sustaining, so that the grant that we might give is a startup. It's not a ongoing thing. But at the same time, there's got to be that top-down advocacy, policy change, systems change. Otherwise, we're fighting an endless battle, and things like climate crisis have got to be addressed at, you know, massive national levels. Otherwise, none of these things are going to change. But again,
plays so big in international politics at the moment, you know, thinking about it, talking about it.
Exactly, yeah. Getting the right voices then, getting the voices of children and people from these communities who are living it and experiencing it every day. And yeah, a question I ask all the time is, who's around the table, and who should be here, and whose voices are being heard and whose voices aren't being heard?
And now you do what they tell you. And now you do what they told you. And now
It'd be interesting to hear some examples of the kind of innovation you're talking about, because that sounds really, really fascinating. Because weirdly, my story has some similarities, but obviously different. I went to Tanzania for a while with Tear Fund, and I'd already done a degree in developing third world studies it was called at the time, and long time ago, and
Not that long ago, actually.
yeah. That's quite old. It was quite a while. And I think between my degree and being in Tanzania for a year, it kind of ruined my naive thoughts that development was a good thing. And I kind of thought, yes, how do we talk a lot about bottom up, but how on earth do you actually do it? And I think I just decided I'm not really sure it can be done, so I gave up on the sector, which, was a bit of a cop-out.
Oh no, I've wanted to do that on a daily basis.
But it's interesting because now I'm in much more of a business space, and I can see a little bit the same for myself in that I'm trying to run a business with social purpose, and there are grants out there, but they're so impossible you'd end up shaping your business in such a way as to meet all the requirements of the grant that would mean you weren't doing anything that was useful, or what was, there's been a number of times when I could have taken a turn that might have brought in some money for X, Y, or Z, but I knew it wasn't the right thing to do. And so I'm sort of seeing those things from both sides. But just really interested in what you think kind of is coming down the track, because I think there's such possibility with technology that we're not necessarily harnessing.
Absolutely. And I think the thing I liked about innovation and kind of got into it because of my role in the funding space was exactly what you were saying, of like, so many donor funds are like, we want to do this and we want to do this and we want to do this, and here's our outcomes, and what are you going to do to get them? And as you say, like, it's super frustrating because you're like, well, that's not really what's actually needed, or like, that's how do you kind of then square peg round hole to get the money that you need. I think innovation is different both as a funding mechanism, because often it starts off with like quite small grants to kind of test and pilot and try on new things. So it's a little bit more open, and certainly the first kind of, or one of the earlier innovation funds that I applied for was basically off the back of COVID, and it was like, you can't do your normal programming. How can we help you to still achieve what you're planning to achieve, but through a different way? And so that was a really good grant, and they gave us that kind of startup. And I think now it's about, I kind of had this thing of, we're all innovators and we're all innovating all the time. And particularly, I've got a real heart for displaced people. And some of the work we're doing at the moment is with displaced people in West Nile in northern Uganda. And, just for somebody to flee to another country, to build a life there, to find a home, you've got to be innovative, you've got to be creative. And so they've actually got all the skills. So it's kind of looking at like, how do we create a space for people to do that and to come up with their ideas and come up with their solutions. And this is what we're looking at doing in Uganda. And actually through the church, and, for all its limitations that we all know and love, in places like Uganda, the church is really central in the community. And actually, how do we position them to kind of almost be a space of innovation, an innovation hub, and a kind of, they can then decide, oh, this innovation looks really promising. We could provide some startup capital for you and coach you in that, or connect you in the network. And so my role really is that kind of facilitating and coaching, like, okay, what does innovation look like? How do you create an innovation plan? Like, what's a learning loop look like? Like, all the ideas, all the kind of content is coming from people on the ground, and ideally displaced people themselves. And I think it's also about, one of the things I really noted when I was there recently was how displaced people are seen as a real drain on resources. There was a lot of comments of, before the South Sudanese came, things were good. Before they came, I could get a hospital appointment. Now I can't. I mean, you get the same here, right? Like, so actually, how do we then flip that narrative to those people are providing the resources that are so stretched, either through technology, for example, like SMS texting of health services. So you can immediately text a doctor and get a kind of quick SMS response on like a small USSD phone on a toll-free line, so that you don't have to sit for 4 hours in hospital and miss a day in the field. And what if a displaced person was the one who came up with that solution? So actually they were like, oh, we love that these people have come because they've helped us access hospitals in ways that we wouldn't have done, or, connecting people from South Sudan with the South Sudanese doctors so they can speak in their own language. Or so I think it's about facilitating those ideas on the ground, and again, that kind of getting out of the way and creating space. And I think the space that I'm in at the moment, I'm very lucky because, we've been invested in as an innovation lab, so we're allowed to kind of play and figure out and
things are allowed
trial.
to fail.
Things are allowed to fail.
That's the other thing, isn't it? All these safeguards, or you can have this grant if you meet this or this criteria.
100%.
It's all trying to stop corruption or all things going wrong.
Yeah.
So if you take that off, then
Yeah.
you've got to allow. And is that happening? Are people being allowed
It really is, and I think it depends on the funder, and it helps when you're not having to be completely wedded to kind of massive government contracts, because that's my old job, was that, and it was literally payment by results. Like, if you get this much, then we'll give you the next tranche of funding. So there's no space to play. Whereas now I think, with more like individual donors, trusts and foundations, innovation funds themselves, flexible funding is becoming more of a thing. There is that space to kind of do that. So I think it's happening. I think, and the Gates Foundation are good. Like, they've done some good innovation funds in kind of, tapping into new things. I think we've still got a long way to go in the funding space, but it's getting there. And like different organisations popping up with innovation labs, and the more we can just kind of keep doing it, I guess, and kind of keep getting the word out there, like, this is effective. And the project I talked about in Rwanda, so we had 200 savings groups, and each group was provided with a loan of, I think it was about $100, it wasn't very much, which basically was distributed between members because all of their savings had gone on survival, basically, during the pandemic. And then we had an agreement with each group that they would pay back the loan after so many, I think it was after 6 months. But if they siphoned off 20% of it as a disaster response fund, so that if that happened again, they'd have some sort of savings, like an insurance fund, and then also 20% of it to kind of community action. So it might be, so one group bought a new iron sheets for a guy's house because his house had been destroyed in flooding, then they could pay back the loan without any interest. And so we were seeing that happen. And so that was just amazing because they, like I say, they knew this man in the community whose house had been like washed away in the floods, and they were straight away able to be like, we've got this money, we can help you. And then we're like, great, you don't have to do interest because you've given that money away, paying it forward basically. And then they pay, and throughout a 2-year cycle, we were able to reach 1,500 groups with the same amount of money.
Wow.
And that then really scaled up. So actually, like, some of the bigger donors that we were then working with, the government donors, were like, oh, we want you to do that with our savings groups. And even the government of Rwanda were like, we love that idea. Like, can we take that on? And some of the phone network companies were like, well, what if we did it through mobile savings so that we could send the money through that and we can track that, and that makes it easier for management. So I think it's that kind of thing of like starting small and seeing how things progress, and then having a good like learning strategy and a way to kind of be like, and also to be honest, like, we tried this and it didn't work, but then when we partnered with the mobile phone company, that was really effective, or this was an interesting way of doing it, or we learned it was really important to have contracts with the savings group so that they knew they were committed to, giving the money back or whatever. But that was a really just a crazy, amazing example of how a really small idea was able to kind of be translated hugely, which is really, really fun. I think about a lot.
What is the role of Christianity in the spaces that you've seen? This is a huge question.
This is a huge question.
There is, there's this the kind of things that I often need to make room for in my work is to explain why people go to churches that promise a lot and give a lot to some and not a lot to few, and yet they seem to be the ones that are growing, that collect the aspirations of people. There are enough good reasons for it. Going to a church that is glitzy, big, media-centric, important. Yeah. Say, my pastor flies a jet. Or even, why do people buy lottery tickets? That dream, my miracle might come tomorrow. That's one side of that question. And so, you will have seen a lot of that in Rwanda. You also might have seen other forms of Christianity that are more sort of liberation-oriented and like talking about systemic injustices and those kinds of things. But what have you learned about, the role of Christianity in that? Because, it is... My experience in Ethiopia has been that it's easy to love the persecuted. It's very tough to love the people who are in charge. Yeah. Because it seems that Christianity doesn't make us better when we have power.
Yep, absolutely.
So I'm interested in your learning experiences. Sorry, this is a quite leading question. I'm unpacking a lot of my own trauma in this space here. I need you to give me hope.
Well, I remember as you were talking, I was just thinking one of the many times I'd just come back from Uganda, pretty much fresh off the plane, and I went to a well-known Christian festival, summer festival, and I remember walking into like the big top, this huge tent, there's about 10,000 people, and I literally went, nope, and just turned around and walked straight back out again, and I was like, I cannot cope with this. Like, all of what you've just said, I was like, it is fake. It is lights and it's sync music and it's like, oh, this is amazing, and it's like, this isn't real though. And I think it comes back to, I guess there's two things. One of them is, I remember a pastor I'd spoken to in Uganda, and you know, it was a really kind of amazing small church and sort of really serving, and he sort of said to me, you know, I think so often we go to these big events and it's like we're just playing at being Christians, and we're playing at it. And I think that really spoke to me. But even more so as you were talking, and I was thinking, well, how am I going to answer this?
Sorry, well, you get a long warning time with your...
Yeah, that's true. I think I kind of had to remove it from the church, which is maybe controversial, and Jesus. And for me, I like to write poetry, so it's a shameless plug for my poems, which are on Instagram as Anna Uera. And but I wrote a poem a few years ago where I put my trust in a brown skin refugee baby. And ultimately for me, Jesus was a freedom fighter, was a persecuted minority, not accepted, not wanted rebel who stood up to the systems of oppression and stood up to even the church, right? The Pharisees, the ones who knew the law. And he was like, you've got it all wrong. And so I think a lot of my hope comes from Jesus. And I think, again, like that thing of relationships, of finding people who actually express the Jesus that I know and love. And there are so many frustrations of the church, and like, I'm a vicar's daughter, I could go on for hours about my frustrations with the church, but somehow I still love Jesus. And I think that for me, that's the drive. And I also just try and think, where can I remove myself from those places that aren't helpful? So I don't need to go to some mega church with great lighting and a pastor wearing, you know, $10,000 shoes. Like, if that's the church, if that's how they're presenting, then I know that's not the church for me. That's not the Jesus that I worship. Actually, I want to go somewhere where it's like, we're real and we're honest and we're open. And one of the things I loved about my church in Uganda was it was so real, and it was so the heart for the community. And a lot of the churches that I'd seen, particularly in sort of these like smaller villages, like in the slum community I mentioned as well, like right in the heart of that community was a church. And I mean, it was a, you know, wooden shed basically. But that's where we ran the educational clubs, the catch-up classes, the outreach. And all the kids came because it was literally in the middle of the community. And the pastor was like, he was lovely. And he was like, you know, I love that you're doing this. We want to work alongside you. So I think it's finding those people and seeing, and it's coming back to the Bible as well. Like, we're doing some work at the moment in Malawi, looking at sort of church-led community transformation and how we do that with children and a child focus, and how do we equip and empower church leaders and then church members to care for their community, care for their environment, support each other, meet the greatest need without any external funding. And some of the results of that have been absolutely phenomenal. And I guess there's always going to be difficult and broken people, but it's coming back to those examples of hope. And yeah, for me, it's coming back to the person of Jesus and who he is. And I often, there's a thing that's pops up every so often on social media. It says, you know, Lord, forgive me for sitting at the tables that you would have flipped over. And for me, that's the thing of like, Jesus is the one who flips the tables. And if that's what I need to do, then that's what I'll do. And I've felt very angry at times about how the church has acted in the space of injustice, and recently with safeguarding issues, and it breaks my heart. It really does, and I am really in that space of like, how can I still believe? I guess all I can think of is that like Jesus is the only hope, and he, as much as we're broken by it, he's even more so. But he is working, and he's always working, and he works with broken people. And it's not to say that these things can be brushed under the carpet. They shouldn't be, and things should be dealt with, and things should be weeded out as they need to be. But if we can keep that broken and contrite heart in his presence and his authority, and keep going back to who he is, and that's the...
We've been talking a lot about how elusive the risen one is too.
Yeah.
And I think what you were saying reminds me of that more than anything, to say like it's this vision that's haunted by this, we got to do better than this. We have it within us to do better than this, and somehow the church just doesn't seem to capture that.
I think what frustrates me is why is it that hard to get it right? It's like kind of God came in Jesus, and how have we still ended up with a faith that's so easily co-opted? Like you just had a really good phrase that Christianity doesn't do well when people get into power, and somehow why have we ended up with this gospel that is so easily turned on its head and used in the service of all sorts of horrible things? But then I guess that's it. It wouldn't be this beautiful, fragile thing if it was cast iron in any direction and wasn't at all manipulable. It's perhaps part of the beauty and the strengths of it,
and it's not
the weakness.
So I mean, it's not taken serious, the reality of sin, right? I mean, in the evangelical space, we talk about sin in all these sort of either very metaphysical or very sexual ways, but that it so lives within us that everything good we try will get corrupted so easily, and we even see it. Like I'm horrified by how even now, like when you scroll through social media and you see these innocent deaths who have become in that very moment a political message already. So we're so fundamentally broken and won't recognize, and we won't talk about it this way. So and actually what I'm seeing now is we're giving more into the power of sin. Like I see this in myself, and a kind of cynicism, and a kind of saying, well, this isn't going to change. And I do think a lot of these sort of questionable Christian movements, they collect that cynicism. They're very immanentist. God's going to come through for me for my miracle because people have given up that the world can be different. And so
they've personalized it.
Yeah, the personalized. I mean, what are you going to do? Like, I mean, if you've been... Like one of my most vivid images in my early fieldwork was this geographer. I just went in and buy a map of Ethiopia, and I was in my early PhD work, and I was just kind of chatting. And he had seen Haile Selassie, he had seen the Derg, and he just kind of stood there. He said, Ethiopia's never going to change. The same when Abiy Ahmed came to power, and everybody was in hype, and this taxi driver said, nah, this makes no difference. Like, he was the only one then. And just that sort of holding on to that reality of sin, what happens instead is that we've given into it and said, well, let's then just think about small fry things, because we've tried to change systems. This is what African socialism was all about. This vision of a third world, in the positive sense, development. And so it seems like we're entering a cycle almost where religion itself has given into, has forgotten that vision of it could be different in many places.
Some of those in workforces.
So, Anna, we've kept you here for quite a long time, but if you'll permit me, I'd like to ask you one question, but feel free to just politely decline. But yeah, you've talked about the sort of some frantic activity, you talked about some crises, talked about Jesus. So I'm really interested in how your understanding of God, your faith, has changed, and especially in the crisis, maybe especially in the crisis where you stopped quite so much of the frantic activity. What's happened in your faith, your understanding of God?
So much. So much. I think I remember a friend saying to me when I was about 25, 26, and I sort of had my first season, as it were, sort of living abroad, and then came back and I was really angry and I didn't understand and didn't like the church, didn't really want to be engaged in anything. And she said to me, "Yep, your Christian bubble has burst." And I think that was very true. And I think my faith has gone through huge challenges and lows. There's been times when I've really wanted to walk away and been kind of pissed off that like something in me like won't let me. I'm like, for goodness sake, just let me go.
I can get behind
that. This podcast is about now.
I remember saying to someone once, I think it's Psalm 139, and I was like, sometimes I can see like David's frustration. I'm like, where can I go from your love? Just leave me alone. So I think there's that.
It hems me in.
Yeah. And I think, like I sort of talked about, separating some of the challenges of like church, and particularly Western church, and some of the cynicism that I've got from the person of Jesus and who he is. And I think, like having to learn my identity isn't in where I am in the world or what I'm doing. It's because it's who I am. I don't have to prove it. I don't have to be enough of a Christian or a justice warrior, whatever it is, which is the journey I'm still on, for sure. And I think, you mentioned the crisis, and when I was in hospital, and there's been times as well in my life, having people just placed there that you're just like, there's no way other than God that person could have been there. So when I was in hospital, I had this lovely colleague, Chantal. At the time I was working for a charity, which wasn't a Christian charity. I didn't know she was a Christian, but she was our HR person. So she was like, I'm going to come to the hospital to make sure you're okay. And she said to me, like, I don't know if you've got a faith, Anna, but like I listen to this song all the time. And There Was Another in the Fire. And I was like, Chantal, I do, and I needed that. And that song got me through, and I listened to it on repeat that week. And I remember being rolled into surgery, and she took my hand and said, Anna, there's another in the fire. And I just knew that I had the presence of God with me, the peace of God in that like terrifying moment. And I think that's where my faith has landed, is like, I don't get it, and I'm angry, and I'm very angry about how the church has treated a lot of people, both in this country and in places where I've worked. I have a real heart for people who feel like the church could never be for them, or God could never be for them, because of the messages that we've given, whether it be about homosexuality or life choices or personal preference, whatever it is, we've given these messages that we've polarized it completely. Like, some people are over here, and some people are on the other end of the spectrum. And I feel like God has put on my heart to be that bridge for those people. And one thing you were saying, Jörg, was about, cynicism and kind of cynicism. And I remember being at a festival and hearing the phrase a lot, what is it? Cynics are just optimists who got hurt. Right. And I remember hearing that a lot as a teenager. And now as an adult, I think about that a lot. And I'm like, then we need to reach the optimists who've been hurt. We need to reach the cynics, because I was a huge cynic and still am in some ways. And I think that's where my faith now is. Church is a complicated place. It's a challenging place to be as a single person, as a person living with chronic pain, with all of these, that's never been healed, quote unquote, and all the rest of it. But often I have to, like I say, remove that, and I just think, a refugee, Middle Eastern man who was also God, who also stood up for the sex workers and the quote-unquote sinners and the people who no one ever thought God could love. And that's where my faith has grown. It's less of I've got to be in this place, I've got to be in East Africa, because that's where, like God has put, obviously, nations on my heart, but it's more now, it's people. It's people who, are suffering in so many different ways. And it's also about me realising to not projectise everything. You talked about frantic activity, and that was definitely me. And being like, and like I sort of talked about before with colleagues and also with friends, like, I think when I was younger, you know, you're encouraged to kind of reach out to your friends, invite them on Alpha, invite them on this, and I'm like, they're just my mates. I just love them. And if they get to glimpse a little bit of the Jesus that I love because I love them, then great. And it's very flawed, and I probably break all their assumptions of what Christians look like for good and for bad. But I think that's the space that God's called me to be in, and we're figuring it out together.
Well, thank you so much.
My pleasure, thank you.
I feel slightly exhausted by just the description of the frantic activity. So I can't imagine doing it. But I think it's really exciting. I'd love to hear more as you continue with figuring out faith without the proving and the frantic activity. Yeah, it's been fantastic to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been such a privilege. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
You've been listening to Justice Warriors. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also follow us on social media by searching for Justice Warriors, where warrior is spelt like someone who worries about things. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating, since that helps other people find us. Also, please tell your friends about us in real life. We'd love to hear from you. To get in touch, use the email address in the show notes or contact us via the social media links. Thanks for listening.
Told you, and now you do what they told you. Now you're under control. Now you're under control. Now you're under control. Killing in the name of. Killing in the name of. Killing in the name of. You kill.